Sure, there's the argument on the other side that when it comes to public health, you need to balance this collective good with individual autonomy. Sure. But balancing is not negating and eradicating and silencing all contrary opinions, right?
So hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Opening Up with Students Against Mandates. My name is Lee Vossen, and this is Brandon Paradosky. We are thrilled to be joined today with the Dr. Julie Ponesse. Before we dive in, Julie, would you be able to give our audience just a little introduction, sort of your background, education credentials, and how you ended up in the position you're in now, speaking up against mandates?
Yeah. So if we had a couple hours, I would do all of that. I guess the quick version is I have a PhD in philosophy, specializing in ethics and ancient philosophy. I've taught at universities in Canada and the States for about 20 years and have a background in medical ethics as well. The college I work at, which is part of Western University, Huron College, implemented COVID policy generally, and the vaccine mandate was part of that back in August. I chose not to comply with it. One thing led to another. I was terminated. And then in November of last year, I was hired by the Democracy Fund, which is a civil liberties charity in Canada. So that's the short version.
Amazing. How was your experience choosing not to comply with your university's COVID vaccine mandates?
Oh, well, what was it like being a witch burned at the stake? That's pretty much analogous. I'm just imagining. Yeah, this is what's so horrifying about what's going on in Canada is that that's not an acceptable position right now, right? And so as soon as my colleagues, the administrators at my college, mainstream media, got wind of the fact that I was not only, not supportive of these mandates, but that I had planned on not complying and doing so publicly. I'm happy to tell the public that I'm choosing not to comply with this, right? I mean, I thought in Canada we had freedom of speech and that open communication was a virtue and all of that. And then just the worst things are said about you, the worst things imaginable. And the media lied about things I said, and then they take other things you say and twist them. And not once since all of this has started have any of my colleagues who disagree with me, but not once have they said, well, that's a really interesting position. I don't understand where you're coming from, but let's talk about it a bit. I'm curious, None of that. They've just been disparaging and saying pretty terrible things on social media. And this is the culture we're in, right? This is a culture, like we've sort of lost the interest in the nuance for communication, for conversation. And we cancel each other. We just kind of blot each other out and pretend that person didn't even exist, that you're not worthy of airspace or the written word or acknowledgement, and that's what's really deeply troubling about where we've gotten to.
It's almost been taboo to speak anything contrary to the vaccine or to the mandates. As you said, your background is in ethics. Could you touch on some of the points you raise in your book, My Choice, The Ethical Case Against COVID-19 Vaccine Mandates?
Well, it's funny, because I think if people happen upon my story at the university or they, hear someone like me saying things like that there are ethical problems with the vaccine mandates, right? They probably get the impression that that's just my view and that it's anomalous. But actually, we have decades of law and bioethical principles built up in our country to support informed choice, free, autonomous medical decision-making. There's this little thing called My Body, My Choice that nobody wants to talk about anymore. So the position that I'm defending, sure, there's the argument on the other side that when it comes to public health, you need to balance this collective good with individual autonomy. Sure. But balancing is not negating and eradicating and silencing all contrary opinions, right? And so the view that I defend in the book is pretty textbook bioethics in North America, in the Western world, for the last 40 years, right? It's autonomy based. It's when you're dealing with a competent, mature adult, and that person is being given, information about benefits and risks of a procedure, which vaccination is, and they make their own choice. And choices are different for different people for different reasons. Some people are more risk adverse than others. Some people have, they have different medical situations. And even if it wasn't for that, just some people are more, they're more interested in trying new things. They're more interested, they're not so worried about something being investigational, and other people are really worried about that. And I think one of the great things about supporting autonomous medical decision making is that we try to make room for as many diverse opinions like that and personalities as possible, right, within a certain range. So, my book is kind of, or at least the central chapter, which is about the vaccine mandates, is pretty textbook bioethics for the last 40 years. What we see going on in mainstream media and in our government, until recently, we're starting to see some interesting shifts, I think. But from our health professionals is what's rogue in my mind.
Amazing. So one of the questions I would have is, there's a safety risk that comes with vaccines, especially with mandating that. Say if there was no safety risk associated with the vaccines, it was essentially saline, would there still be an ethical case to mandate that on the larger population?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So are the concerns about mandates only harm-based concerns or safety-based concerns, right? Yeah, I think about this a lot. I mean, I think that is the big concern, that when you go to make a medical choice and imagine your doctor says to you, well, you have this heart problem, and really the best option is surgery because it will help increase blood flow or clear a blockage or whatever. But with any surgery, there are these risks, and then you kind of weigh the pros and cons, the benefits and risks for yourself. If there were no risks, no inconveniences, no costs, so nothing kind of in the negative column, you would probably on your own be more likely to agree to a procedure that had only benefits and no harms, right? But what if someone still didn't want to do that? And I think there are arguments, against medical interventions, even when you believe they don't pose harm to you, right? So, the natural movement within healthcare, which many people are adherent to, had a lot of traction, I think, going into 2020. And a lot of people are very concerned about unnecessary pharmaceutical interventions, right? So it's not just a matter for them of avoiding things that they believe to be harmful, but of not addressing health concerns with pharmaceutical products, but in other ways, by boosting their immunity through diet and exercise and nutraceuticals and things like that. So while I think that, safety concerns are the big reason for not mandating vaccines or other, medical interventions, I don't think they're the only reason. I think a person could still have a reasonable objection. And to be quite honest, and this got me into a lot of trouble when I said this to one of the National Post reporters, but I think one of the great things about a country like Canada, at least prior to the last couple of years, is that we have a right to make our own medical choices, even if we have the worst reasons for doing that, and I think that kind of, that ability to be the author of your own life and have a right over what happens to your body, what goes into your body, what goes into your child's body. If we can't protect that in Canada, then we've lost a lot, I think.
So on that note, one of the other points that gets brought up is the greater good, sort of this pie in the sky type of thing, as if you're taking the vaccine for someone else, for your grandpa, grandma, almost as if it's like a martyrdom to take the vaccine on behalf of someone else. So on that note, at this point, it's becoming increasingly clear whether you have the vaccine or whichever number of doses you have, you can still get and transmit the virus. Yeah. So my question is that really still for the greater good? Is the greater good doing something on behalf of someone else, or is the greater good doing what's in your own best interest? And if everyone does something in their own best interest, is that the greater good? I don't know.
Yeah, that's really good. No, really good set of questions. I think you kind of answered your own question. I mean, these are all the relevant questions. I think, part of the territory we have to get into to answer that question fully is the scientific territory. And as you've pointed out, I don't know who on the planet still believes that the vaccines reduce transmission. I don't know. I mean, even the CDC and Fauci have been very, upfront about this. So if the vaccines don't reduce transmission, I was actually just before I got on with you guys in another interview with a former healthcare worker from New York City who said that in his hospital right now, 75% of people in the ICU are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, right? So I don't know. In order to get this argument off the ground that you must get vaccinated for the sake of others, it can only proceed in one of two ways, as far as I can tell. One is if you get vaccinated, you're less likely to give it to others. Well, that's not showing itself to be true, right? And then secondly, maybe the argument is that, well, if you're not vaccinated, you're going to get more sick. So now we're pointing to this severity of illness thing, maybe. And if you get more sick, you're a greater burden on the healthcare system. Well, the problem with that argument is that we don't apply that standard to any other arguably risky behavior that could make you a greater burden on the healthcare system. So we don't mandate certain diets for people who are, who eat too much processed food and too much sugar and then become type 2 diabetic. And then that's an enormous burden on the healthcare system. We don't mandate people who smoke or drink to excess or who don't exercise every day or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And so if we want to follow that line of argument that the reason we should get vaccinated is so that we don't pose an extra burden on the healthcare system, then for the sake of consistency and moral fairness, we need to apply that across the board. Right. So I think, as you're pointing out, that this argument that get vaccinated for the sake of others doesn't succeed on either of the two most plausible interpretations of that view. And even if it did, right, even if you could show that there was good reason for getting vaccinated in order to provide some benefit to other people, you still need to show why your good matters less. Right? Why should you be sacrificed for the sake of others? And on something like a utilitarian moral scheme, well, if you can show that your sacrifice helps more people than just yourself, right? Or produces more good, that the good that you're producing is far greater and weightier than the harm that comes to yourself. Well, then it's justifiable on that utilitarian framework, because the utilitarian says that what matters morally, the only thing that matters morally is that there's the greatest production of good at the end of the day. But that's not the only, and that's not been the prevailing moral view in ethics for decades and decades. It's been more of a deontological rights-based view. So my point about all of that is it's not clear that even if it can be shown that your action benefits others, that you have an obligation to do that thing. So I don't see it succeeding on any grounds, right? I think this collectivist argument is falling apart.
Absolutely. It's almost just become sort of a talking point. Like they've lost the transmission, that it doesn't pass from a vaccinated person, but they continue to use that talking point.
And it sounds great, right? It sounds like, don't you want to protect your grandmother? Of course you. What kind of person would not want to protect her and they're using this on children, right?
Yeah. We have spoken with many people who have felt severe pressure to get vaccinated. And interestingly, they tend to speak to a common theme. General practitioners and agents of medicine recommend vaccination regardless of their medical history or concerns. And it almost seems like this blanketed recommendation without really considering the demographics, lifestyle, etc. How can a physician give a professional recommendation when there's little data about the medical treatment? Isn't informed consent a fundamental of ethics in biomedicine? And would you say when physicians do this, they're technically going against the Hippocratic Oath and its malfeasance?
Wow. You guys ask really good questions. That's a really good question.
Kind of a lot throwing at you too.
No. This is a complicated issue, and there's a lot bundled together, right?
Yeah.
So, but one question you asked is, well, how can physicians do this, right? How can they sort of overlook the medical particulars of their particular patients, gloss over them, right? And then just recommend vaccination for everyone regardless, right? And that is a huge, we are seeing physicians like Dr. Rashadnia Killian in Neuro and Sound in Ontario. She has been delicensed for trying to provide medical exemptions to her patients. So part of the answer to this question, well, how is it they do it? Well, one of the reasons why they're doing it, physicians, is because they don't want to get, a slap on the hand, or much worse than that, lose their medical licenses. And, Christine Elliott in Ontario has said very blatantly that the College of Physicians and Surgeons needs to get a handle on dissenting doctors and punish them appropriately. So doctors have and other healthcare professionals too, if they don't push the vaccines on everyone, they are at risk of losing their job. That's the reality that we're in. The problem with that, in my mind, and a lot of scientists have been talking about the importance of risk stratification when it comes to assessing someone's, risk to getting very sick from COVID, because it affects the age groups disproportionately, right? It affects people over 70. They're at much greater risk than young people, and people like your age or younger. Young children have statistically insignificant risk from COVID. So and people who have comorbidities and other kinds of health concerns, those things matter to whether or not COVID is going to affect you very significantly, and whether or not the vaccines are likely to affect you. One of the big concerns about the vaccines are vascular ones, right? Whether or not you're going to suffer a heart attack or stroke or something akin to that. Well, if you have a history of that in your family already, that's particular information about you, that matters. So the fact that, doctors are not, that they're allegiant to the government, they're allegiant to public health officials, not to their patients, is like this fundamental breakdown in the relationship of trust between a physician and patient. It's also a fundamental breakdown in evidence-based medicine, which is what we are what physicians have been trained to do for decades in Canada now. So it's how does it happen? Well, it's happening for political reasons, but to really disastrous effect, I think. And I think one of the consequences of this will be that people will lose trust in their doctors, in their healthcare professionals. And what's going to happen if that happens? Are people going to trust their opinions as much about other things in the future? Are they going to go to their doctors for healthcare as much in the future? If I can't trust you about this, what else can't I trust you about? I already know a lot of people who are feeling that way. I say, well, I haven't been to the doctor in a year. Goodness, I can't trust them about anything. So I think there's a real breakdown in that intimacy, right? In our ability to trust the people who are supposed to be providing us care and to be working in our interest and not in the interest of the government.
Absolutely.
Right. So going off that point of trust, I feel like the best way to get people vaccinated, if that's your goal, would not be using this heavy-handed approach, but rather having an open debate. But that's something we haven't been privy to. There hasn't been.
That sounds exhausting. Like, why would they want to do that when they can just coerce and manipulate you, which seems to be quite effective,
Yeah. And tell you to
really
trust the science, not question it. Trust means
right.
not question it or have doubt. It's ridiculous.
Which is about the least scientific thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Science demands to be questioned, and they're saying, don't do it. Don't question this. Ridiculous.
Yeah. And to say that this idea that science is perfect and it's never wrong.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So you teach about how it's ethically wrong to force and coerce an individual to take a vaccine, which is exactly what's happening right now. Where's the justice? Where does accountability come in with respect to these government decision makers? I think it's very frightening that in the past 2 years, or 2 years ago, rather, this could not have been thought possible, largely because there's such great faith in our institutions and laws. And that we always believed coercion in any form would be dealt with swiftly. So what recourse do we truly have when our rights and freedoms are infringed upon?
Well, I think, I know that not everything is about this right now, but this movement that we've seen from the truckers, and it isn't just them. They were the ones that kind of coalesced it all, and I think who ultimately had the bravery and the organization to get it going. But I think standing behind them are so many Canadians that are saying, this is enough. You've just gone too far this time. And I think I mentioned earlier that we're seeing a little bit of shifting, in the House right now. And we're seeing some Conservative MPs, a number of them speaking very eloquently, very intelligently, very strongly and persuasively against these mandates. And also we've seen a couple of Liberal MPs, right, who are saying, I think Canadians not only are we dividing them and that's causing a lot of problems, but a lot of Canadians who are resisting these mandates have some legitimate concerns, and we need to listen to them, if nothing else. So I think the fact that the people haven't pushed back enough over the last 2 years, and that's allowed this sort of pseudoscientific, strong-arming, totalitarian liberal government to do whatever it wants to us. And now the fact that we're seeing some challenge to that from within the House, I think is a sign that the people in a grassroots way are pushing back. And kind of the tip of that iceberg are the MPs in the House that are speaking, but they know they have the power of the people. When I was in Ottawa on Monday, so almost a week and a half ago now, 5 different Conservative MPs came to speak on the stage with the truckers in support of what they were doing. Like, I don't think that would have happened a couple of months ago. It wouldn't have happened before the convoy, because I think now they're feeling like there's enough public support to feel like when they speak, they're speaking on behalf of the people. So, I think a lot of people are feeling really, or before the convoy, we're feeling really drained and apathetic and exhausted because individually or in small groups, they've been fighting this fight for so long. But I think all those little fights have helped to lead up to this big challenge to authority. And that's the kind of thing we have to do. And we have to keep doing it in the future. Like, this is not lift the mandate, pop the champagne cork, and we're done. Right? I think we need to remember that this can happen even in a place like Canada, and be on the lookout for the early signs of it that happen in the future. A lot of people for the last year who come from places in the world that have suffered at the hands of their government. So people who were from, Eastern Europe or behind the Iron Curtain, and in the Soviet, from South Africa. And they've said to me, you just don't know. You don't know what's possible. And we see it. We see the beginnings of this now. And they were right, I think,
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I find interesting, we were in Ottawa for a week, and you have tens of thousands of people coming together. And the coverage of all these people coming together is not on COVID or spreading of a virus, which is what we're doing all this in the first place. The coverage is on like racism, violence, like insurrection. So my question is, it's almost as if inherently or implicitly everyone knows that there's not really a significant threat, because it's not a talking point when you just brought together this large group of people, but rather it's shifted to like more hate. So is that implicitly saying like the virus is gone by not covering on that aspect, but shifting to something completely different? I don't know. Could you talk on your experience there?
I agree with you. I think it's, I think I said earlier that like what you see in the mainstream media is just totally different from what it's like being there, right? I'm sure you guys experience that. And you also notice the complete absence of mainstream media there, which I think is not a coincidence. I don't know if you know Kristen Nagel. She's the nurse who speaks out, and I forget the name of her group. Is it Nurses Against something? I forget, but she was on the street and she was walking around and she ran into a couple of the CBC reporters and she said to them, she said, how can you do this? How can you not report the truth? How can you not report what's actually going on here? And the reporter said something like, it's not up to me.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, you know, if you know you're in a losing battle, divert, right? Don't tackle the issue head on. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things going on in Ottawa right now. One is it's pretty much the perfect conditions. I mean, other than maybe the temperature, and I'm not a virologist, but pretty good conditions for the spread of disease if you want to make it happen, right? Because you have a bunch of people, close quarters, most of them, many of them, not all, but most are self-professedly unvaccinated, and they're in close quarters. There's not really a lot of ability to wash your hands. They're not wearing masks. So if the pro-narrative people are right, there should be massive outbreaks of COVID in Ottawa right now, shouldn't there?
Yeah. I haven't heard one mention of it on the news or social media or anything. It's all about the white supremacy.
All about, yes. And people are not getting sick and falling down from what I understand. I certainly didn't see it and I haven't heard it from anyone else. So that's a pretty strong piece of evidence against the pro-narrative view, right? Against the idea that, oh my goodness, you're going to get struck down dead unless you go out and get vaccinated right away. You're going to be a threat to others. And I think the other side also knows that they're just losing on the science, right? And if they go toe to toe with this, I mean, a number of scientists, Dr. Byron Bridle, have challenged formally Dr. Theresa Tam and other members of the federal government, sort of representing the federal government's health position, have challenged them to an open debate, televised open debate. Let's come together. Let's hash this out. Let's show the Canadian people, what's your evidence? Show us. Here's our evidence, right? And they won't do it. So I think when you have that kind of intractability on scientific grounds, and when the other side, I think, knows they can't win on those grounds, you got to change the terms. Let's accuse them of something else, something that is very hard to sympathize with. If we paint these people, if we call them names, it's just an ad hominem attack, right? It's an attack on their character. If we say that they are racist white supremacists, then presumably no one will believe anything else they say. Well, they aren't racists or white supremacists, not as a group anyway. I'm not saying that there aren't some within them, but not as a group. And so that, I think that challenge is losing ground,
Absolutely.
But it's a powerful distracting tactic, right?
I completely agree. We spoke to a bunch of people in Ottawa and it was almost comical asking them, what do you think of mainstream media's reporting on this? Like, it was almost like asking that question was just foolish because you already know the answer to it. But stepping away from that for a second, what do you think is the biggest threat to Canadians right now, just in general?
Honestly, I think it's the fact that they believe they don't have the right to think for themselves. We've been told that it's selfish to do so, that it's arrogant to do so because we're not the experts. We're supposed to outsource our thinking to the so-called experts, and that if we try to make decisions for ourselves and our family about things that the experts are supposed to have authority over, then we're stepping out of our proper bounds. We're stepping out of our area of expertise, and we're arrogant and we're selfish. And it takes a lot of courage to fight against that. But I think until we reclaim confidence in our ability to think for ourselves and skills to communicate with each other openly and respectfully, we won't get our democracy back. We won't get our lives back.
It's almost as if the government's playing the role of like father, like saying to the public, oh, you can't see this information because you couldn't figure out the correct answer yourself, or
you wouldn't understand, so we'll just make this decision for you.
Yeah, like we need to censor it, like you can't see it. But one of the things I find really interesting in something like we totally all agree on, like saying the earth isn't flat, no one's censoring that. People can integrate that information, whether someone's presenting, oh, the earth is flat, you can integrate that information, think for yourself, and come to a conclusion. But here, the general public is not really even being privy to information that's contrary to the government, but it's under the guise that you can't think for yourself. So I guess my question is it ethical to hide information from people or censor it or suppress it, even if it is false? Like playing devil's advocate?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because John Stuart Mill, who's sort of the father of utilitarianism, and utilitarianism is really invoked these days in order to make that sacrifice yourself for the common good argument, right? But he wrote about free speech and how important it is. And he said, it's like free speech is really valuable because it gives you the opportunity not just to hear what someone else has to say, and then you might be able to learn something, and you might be able to find out truth, and you might be able to correct your own view, but it also gives you the opportunity to either to see errors in your view or to develop new reasons for what you believe is right. So, even someone like that, who's a collectivist, arguably, thinks that free speech is important because we don't do, not just ourselves, but we don't do anyone any favors by hiding the truth. And you asked if that's ethical, to hide information, even if it's false. Well, I think it is unethical. I think that, informed consent matters for a reason. And it's important that we can consent or refuse to consent, I think, based on our having seen all of the information that might matter to us, and us making a choice about what information is better than others, what pieces of information seem more true than others, and not having those decisions made for us by other people. Then our choices aren't really informed. And if they're not informed, then they're not really consensual.
And
almost, go ahead.
Who really gets to decide what is true and what is not? That's been happening like across all social media platforms. They say, no, fact checker, taking this off. And then a number of months later, it's confirmed to be true. So who really,
and even if it wasn't, is there harm in it being, look at what's happening to Joe Rogan. Don't you kind of just want to say, go ahead, go Joe, say what you want. People listen to Joe. If you want to listen to Joe, listen. The reason why Joe is, I think, such a target is, for one thing, he's compelling, I think, to listen to. He's interesting. But it's huge money. Who just offered him $100 million to leave Spotify? Rumble.
Yeah.
$100 million, right? There's huge money. And he's voicing usually unpopular opinions, right? And if in this mandate situation, well, if we lift mandates and people aren't required to get vaccinated anymore, now all of a sudden, big drug company profits go from, well, I don't know what we're at now, 50 billion, but upwards, depending on how many boosters people get. That's going to start to slide. It's a lot of money, And it's not to say, what's that?
No, we can't have that. Can't have their profits.
Can't have that. And, I don't want to say that any time money is at play, it means that people will always choose the money over something else. But I think when you're dealing with money that's that significant, we just have to be aware that conflict of interest can exist, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Were you going to ask a question, Brandon?
Yeah. What I find interesting about that Joe Rogan topic is instead of coming on and having a debate, they seek to just shut down even the conversation. So I feel like what the more, I guess, interesting part is how has Joe Rogan compelled so many people to believe in what he is saying? And why can't the opposite side compel that many people? So if
Good question.
if it was so clear, if the science is so clear that we all need this vaccine for who knows how long, then just take one of your experts, put them on the Joe Rogan show, debate for everyone to hear. But instead of that, they seek to shut down even the conversation. So I feel like just in that aspect, it's, I don't know,
Well,
just comical.
It's comical, but the thing that really I find sad about it, Brandon, is that that doesn't bother more people, right? The fact that our public health, either the American ones, Walensky or Fauci, or in Canada, Theresa Tam and Bonnie Henry and Christine Elliott, all these people, the fact that they won't engage in public debate, that they won't provide evidence, but that they just keep insisting over and over to give their orders and you must comply or else. The fact that 80 some percent, 90% of people are saying, okay, that sounds good to me. That sounds like the way a rational person goes about making decisions for his or her life. That's what's really terrifying to me. I think if they provided some information and said, well, we think that scientific, current scientific evidence suggests that this is the best medical choice for most people. And here's why. Okay, that would make some kind of sense, right?
Yeah, I noticed that even before the pandemic, that sort of attitude of shutting down conversation. If someone's labeled a certain thing like a white supremacist, you don't give them a voice, you don't listen to them. And then that word, those trigger words or labels are being given to all these different people who really don't embody those things. And it's just to silence them, because if you give a racist a platform, if you listen to one, then you become one, and which is just illogical, but it's a good way of shutting down contrary opinions.
It's so effective, right? And it's playground tactics. I mean, this is what 5-10-year-olds do in the playground, right? They have a disagreement, they're not winning, so they call the other person a name. It's really insulting, and they win. End of conversation. And the problem is, we're supposed to teach our children that that's not respectful behavior, and we're certainly not supposed to be showing by example that that's how you win, and that's how you convince someone, right? I mean, there's a difference between manipulation and rational persuasion, right? We're not supposed to be, as adults, as government officials, as physicians with positions of medical authority, we're not supposed to be bullying people to do what we want them to do, right? We're supposed to offer our opinion and let them make their own choices. And maybe rationally persuading if we feel that they're making the wrong choice. Maybe, I'm not even sure about that. But the key there is rational persuasion and explaining why you think that the person should make that choice, right? It's just appalling what we're doing, right? And I had the pleasure of interviewing Jordan Peterson the other day, and he had some really interesting things to say about how our pandemic response is both gendered and why it's become about race. So I'd encourage you guys, or your viewers, to take a look at that. I can't remember when in the conversation, but it's so interesting, right? His thinking as a psychologist, why our conversations so quickly go to these issues of race.
Yeah, we listened to that interview. It was excellent. He's fantastic. But we do want to be respectful of your time too. I know you only had 30 minutes. So I was wondering, just to sort of close off, if you had one message for our audience, for students, for concerned citizens, parents, what would that be? What would you want to say to them? Advice or a message or anything?
I guess I would say that, I've talking with a lot of people, in those 8 people who are parents and then students and children. Prior to the last week or so, when we've started to see some movement in Ottawa, but I know people had been feeling really isolated and alone and tired and frustrated. And what's the point? None of this is working anyway. And if going to Ottawa taught me anything, it's that, you're not alone. There are so many people out there who are just like you, who want to live a free life, who don't want our government to force things upon us, and who just want to be able to protect their children. And, if we give up, then we've lost. Clearly, that's the one sure way of guaranteeing that we will lose. But in the trying and the persevering, we will never lose in that. And I think luckily we are starting to see some changes. We are starting to see a light on the horizon. And that's because so many people have been working so hard at this for a long time now.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was great. Do you have any questions at all for us before we close off?
It's so great to talk with you guys. So you're both in Manitoba, are you? Are you both students?
Former student for me. I did drop out. I had one term left, but I decided I had enough with what was going on. I think I could only get into one class, and it was online, and I just felt like I didn't want to support the college, so I dropped out. But Brandon, you can speak to what's happened with you.
Yeah, I'm a Master's of Science student, but I can't go to campus. So I can't technically complete my thesis for not being able to go on campus.
Right. That's big. I was listening to the radio this morning, and they were talking about how so many young people, like if you think about some of the big markers in, like, if you're sort of 20 to 30 or something, and, graduating university or college and picking a career, maybe getting married, having children, buying a house, like, I don't know, whatever your goals are, right. Or traveling or something. And that most people within that age group can't do a number of those things right now. And so it'll be really interesting, kind of worrisome to see what effect that's going to have on people's lives few years down the road or later into life, but I'm really proud of you guys and people like you who make the choices that you've made, because they're hard choices. I know a lot of people who just chose to kind of, I'll just get vaccinated, or I'll just get an exemption. I'll just go with the flow. But it's people who are resisting, like you guys, that are really making a difference. So good for you.
Thank you so much
for having me today.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.